Okay. Um, you can just see from that how desolate it is. There's nothing. Every once in a while, when it rains a little bit, you might get some like some desert flowers that'll pop up. But otherwise, it is one of the most desolate places you've ever been to. And some of this stuff, I don't have these pictures in here now, but it looks almost like the surface of Mars. It's really, I mean, I think it's beautiful actually.
Hmm.
But I'm still hearing your buzzing. But anyway, I was just for background. For background, I've been a project bioarchaeologist since 2000 with this outfit, and this is called the Combined Prehistoric Expedition. And it originally involved people from uh, a guy by the name of Fred Wendorf from Southern Methodist University, and then also the Geological Survey of Egypt, and the Polish Academy of Sciences. So it was three different groups, and they had been working out in the Western Desert since, I mean, good Lord, since I think about the 1970s. But in 2000, I joined them because up till that point, they had only focused on archaeology. They didn't really do much with, skeletal biology, human osteology, and I was really waiting to look at this because that was my focus of my research was to look at the peopling of Africa. And so I went out for the first time in 2000, and I've been working as their project bioarchaeologist ever since. And like you had mentioned, I first even worked at Nabta Playa, which is nearby to the site I'm going to talk about today. And it was discovered, this Gebel Ramlah, this area was discovered in 2000 by a couple of our colleagues. And there were human skeletal remains all over the surface. It's like, wow, what's going on? So what we did is we initially excavated over 60 skeletons out of what turned out to be a lot more in this area. And in fact, we're over 200 skeletons right now as through the last season that we had. But just to give you an idea of where it's located at, here's a picture of Egypt. Here's the site of Jebel Ramlah. And I should have put it on here, but here's the Nile. And right in this area here is the city of Aswan. So you can kind of get a general idea that it's out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. So it's about 250 kilometers or so southwest of Aswan. Just north of the border was Sudan. And this whole area is full of Neolithic remains, habitation sites. Some date back to 9,000. But we're focusing here at Jebel Ramlah on the final Neolithic, which is about, in this particular site only, lasted from about 4,600 to 4,400 BC, which would be about 6,600 years ago or what have you. And specifically, what we refer to as Jebel Ramlah is this flat-topped mountain here. I'll show a picture of it in a second. And it would have been during the time period quite a bit wetter there, and so there would have been a lake in the middle of the desert. It would have been like a seasonal lake. So the rainy season would be in the summer, and these people that ended up burying their dead at these sites and also living here would have been like moving back and forth. So like in the winter, they'd go to the Nile Valley, and then they would move back out here in the during the summer when it was raining. And so this is just like, there's several of these jebels out in this area, and there's a lot of these what would have been paleo lakes near them. So this is just one of several. And so these are some of the sites just located around here. So anyway, this is the area that we're at. Here's what it looks like. It's really desolate. There's probably not even 4 millimeters of rain per year, but it would have looked like this during the Neolithic. So if you think of the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern United States, it's a desert and it's hot, but it's actually quite lush. There's a lot of succulents, plants, and so forth, and a lot of animals. And so this area, which now looks, like I said, the surface of Mars, would have been quite lush. Here's in the background, this is Gebel Ramlah, and this area hall right here would have been water during the summers, and then it would have dried up as the rainy season ended. And then again, then they would migrate back to the Nile. And so even though it doesn't look like much, if you just walk along the surface, there are artifacts everywhere. So there are literally hundreds of sites out here. A lot of them are habitation sites. But the thing that caught my interest, of course, was the fact that there are so many cemeteries. And so you can see a few of these things on the surface. These are stone artifacts. There's also pottery. They had pots because it was a Neolithic period. Charred plants, so they were, cooking. And they also had, like a lot of people today that are herders in Northeast Africa, would have had domesticated cattle and either goats or sheep. And so they would have had these herds of animals that they would have migrated back and forth with. So pretty interesting stuff going on. And again, it looks incredibly dead out there, but at the time, they would have been intensively collecting and processing wild plants. They didn't grow their own plants like a lot of Neolithic peoples did, like say from the Middle East. But instead, because it was relatively lush here, they could just collect the local plants. And as you can see here, there's grinding stones everywhere. It's kind of neat to think we found it like this. Here is the hand grinder and then the base stone, and it's just sitting right on top of that. So 6,000 years ago, somebody set that down on the top of the base and walked away, and we're the first ones to see it after that. It's really kind of cool. So they were eating a lot of plants, along with probably milk and blood that they would get from their cattle and probably the sheep as well. But there's a lot more to it than that, because these people were amazingly advanced. Again, they're transhuman, so they're going back and forth between the Nile and the middle of the desert. But we were able to find, for example, on the upper right here, all these gigantic stones are not native to the area. They had to be brought in. And at one time they were in alignments. So this is just predating the sites I'm going to talk about in a little bit. This is the late Neolithic. And these would have been lined up in astronomical, at least that's what the archaeoastronomer had talked to us about, that these were actually lined up so that they would, at certain times of the year, they would point to the constellation of Orion. The stars up there are beautiful. But there's like these megalithic alignments. They had calendar circles. This one in the lower right, you can see it's not huge, but it's still impressive. It's about 3 meters across. And there's a line of sight where it would point to the North Star. And this on the left here, this is really, I think, cool. This is a cattle burial. You can see how deep it is now. I had to use a backhoe to dig down partway, and then folks had to get in with shovels. And this soil is like concrete. It's rock hard. So I had to, get in to this depth. You can see how deep it is. But this gigantic boulder here is actually, once we got it out, you could see that it had been shaped. So it was in the shape of a cow. And underneath this massive boulder, which we could hardly get out with a backhoe, was the skeletal remains of a cow. So they had buried it underneath in this super deep hole, put this massive boulder on top of it. And I mean, in order to do that, it would have taken lots of people, a lot of work. So these weren't just simple herders. They were really, doing something impressive at this time.
Does that imply that maybe it was somehow like a sacrificial cow, or?
Yeah, probably.
Mhm.
In fact, I should have mentioned it too, that when you see Jebel Ramlah in the background, it's quite difficult to get to the top of it. But we got up and we were looking around, and we found that there had been cattle sacrificed up on top of this thing too. So it's really hard to walk up there. If human-wise, I couldn't imagine how they got cattle to go up the sides of this very steep hill. We looked all over the place, couldn't find really a better area to go up. But what they had done in some cases is they actually, apparently sacrificed the cow, but then cremated it So there is cremated cattle bones all over the surface of that jebel in the background.
Hmm.
But so back to 2000, when we first discovered these cemeteries, like I said, there were skeletal remains just laying on the surface. And the reason for that is because of wind erosion, which they call deflation. So you can see here, it's just sand, and the wind blows constantly, generally from the north. And a lot of the skeletons were in the process of being sandblasted out of existence. So you'd see like little fragments here and there. And then eventually, this is the first cemetery, or the first burial that we found over here on the left. And it turned out to be a secondary burial. There was like 7 people buried in this pit, all put in together. But that's not the normal way of doing it. Normally, it's like this burial on the right, where the individual would be laid on their right side, flex. See, they got the knees and the arms drawn in, with their back to the north, and then the head pointing west. So they're all pointing in the same direction. And what this turned out to be was the largest Neolithic skeletal sample in Egypt that we had come across. Because up until this point, there were very few Neolithic sites that had been looked at least the skeletal remains. So this was quite impressive in that way alone. What's also quite interesting is that some of this, of the secondary burial, and I'll show some pictures in a second, is actually the reason they're disturbed is because they were disturbed by people from that group burying later individuals. So you mean, you look around, it's like miles in all direction, but they seem to have these very demarcated areas that they would bury people in. And so they would dig down, it's like, oops, there's somebody there. So they'd have to move those remains off to the side to put the new individual in. So this actually is fairly common. But lots of really cool grave goods. You can see up here, there's a nice pot. Here's another, they call a tulip beaker over on the side here. And here are some really nice ideas of what were available there, what they used for grave goods. So there's like this gray diorite bowl. It's about, you can see how big it is. Here's a skull here, so you can kind of see it's almost as big as someone's head. But I mean, it's just beautifully made. Look at how circular that is. It would have taken a lot of work. There are these tulip beakers that they call them because they kind of look like a tulip. They would not have been used in everyday life, but they were made specifically for grave goods. Really interesting way to do it is that they would make the bottom round because they have sand, and so you could just kind of push it down into the soil, and you could use it for that. And some of the larger, more utilitarian vessels were like that. They also had, you can see down here, mica, huge sheets of mica that they put into the burials. And in this case, it was carved, so it looks like a tilapia from the Nile, a type of fish that's there. You got the eye, which is right here. There's the dorsal fin, the back fin, and the lower fin. And then you've got these beautiful carved stone points and celts. And as you can see, actually this material is quite soft, so they wouldn't have used it in real life. It was just for the burial. So it's just gorgeous, some of the stuff that they included in here. And the skeletons themselves, as you can see here, they look in pretty good condition, but they're in really poor, or I'd say fair state of preservation, and that most of the times they couldn't be lifted out of the ground. Now, on the right, we were able to get one out. We're putting some preservative on there so that we could take it back to the lab and I could do some better measurements. But in this case, on the side here, I actually pretty much standing on my head in order to take cranial metrics, cranial measurements, and also measurements of long bones and so forth, because most of the time you couldn't get the material out in good order. But most of the work, so then, it was done right in the ground. And from these initial excavations from about 2001 to 2003, we recovered 5 infants, 10 children, 2 juveniles, and 50 adults. So a total of 67 total people were buried in these 2 cemeteries, which were located right next to one another. You know, what's also really cool is that these folks often lived into old age, like well over 40 years old, and they appeared skeletally healthy. So that's quite nice. I mean, it's almost like a the perfect life. You're not in one area long enough to get disease. You're moving back and forth. You got good food. You've got a lot of protein, and so these people are really in pretty good health. So just kind of give you an idea. Uh, One way of determining health, it's also genetic, of course, but healthy people are more likely to be taller than people who are sickly and having issues. And so this image here, there shows Gebel Ramlah. This is the stature in centimeters. The females aren't quite as high, they're in red, but the males are quite tall. They're taller or as tall as any of these other Nubian groups. Nubia is a region south of Aswan, which is where Gebel Ramlah is at. And so they're a separate group of people that the Egyptians were often at war with, just kind of a little background there. But they were taller than almost all Nubians, other than this group here, and that can be thrown out because I found out that Jebel Sahaba is really, the people that lived there were not locals. They came from sub-Saharan Africa. But they're also taller than all of these different periods of Egyptians. So quite tall, which indicates in some ways good health. And then I focus on teeth. I mean, I do the whole thing. I do the whole skeletal analysis, but I like focusing on teeth because you can determine all sorts of stuff like what type of food they're eating, how healthy they were. You can determine biological relatedness and that sort of thing. But in this case, you can see the teeth are in pretty good shape. A little bit of wear, as one would expect, because there's sand, so you're going to get sand in your food. They're also using those grinding stones that I showed. And so when you're grinding up different plant material, you get stone grit in the food, and that also causes your teeth to wear. But otherwise, incredibly healthy. They had what's really interesting, I've never been to a site like this, is what this picture shows is caries prevalence. That means how many cavities did they have? It's a standard cavity. And they had none. And this was early, this was done on the 60-some individuals we first recovered. But like I said, now we're up to 200 individuals, and we still have not found one cavity. That's just incredible. And this is compared to other Egyptian here on the right, and to other groups called Nubians, who you can see have it in some cases up to 40% of individuals have cavities, and they had nothing. So really healthy. They did do a minimal amount of cultural modification of teeth. Now, there are some groups in Africa, like they'll sharpen their incisors or put carving on them, chipping, or they'll purposely remove teeth. These guys didn't do that much, although there is one example here of the lower central incisors having been removed prior to death. And then this one on the left side here, this is a tooth showing what we call a toothpick groove. And that is from habitually, some people, not so much anymore because it's hard to find toothpicks anymore, but it used to be people would like jam a toothpick in between their tooth and just like keep it there. And that's what this person was doing here. So you can see that is from sticking like a very fine piece of stick or something in there in between the teeth. But also, as I mentioned before, a lot of the burials that had been previously interred were later disturbed, like several decades, 100 years later, by the same people who moved back there. And so they dig down, it's like, oh man, here's a skeleton. So they would move the original individuals off to the side, and they would try, in many cases, to reposition them. In some cases, they did a pretty good job, not always. This is really interesting. These are two adult males from one burial, and these two had both been replaced by a later burial of a woman. And so they pushed everything off to the side. And so what happens, you can picture the people who are digging the graves, they pick up this skull of the previous owner of the grave, and all of the teeth fall out of his head. And so it's like, oh, so they shove it back into his eye orbit here. And in this case, this tooth here, the anterior tooth, had fallen out, so they put it into his nose, his nasal cavity. And this is actually wasn't that uncommon in this site. It's really interesting. And we even found other bizarre things, really interesting. This is a carved, what looks like to be a tooth, a human tooth. It's artificial. It's made out of saltwater shell, probably from the Red Sea. And size-wise, it fits perfectly with what would be a lateral incisor. There's no way of determining if it was actually ever used, other than perhaps to put into a skull. Unfortunately, this wasn't found in a burial. It was found after the soil had been displaced by wind. So I can't really put this directly into the skull, into the tooth socket, but it's really interesting that they would have gone to all this work to carve what looks like a human tooth. So anyway, that was our original work. And then we stopped for a while. Remember, there were a lot of issues in the Middle East where it wasn't a good idea for tourists or anybody working there to come back. But by 2009, we did come back. And this is when we found all these new sites. So these other sites that I was talking about, that I was showing you the pictures of, they're in pretty good shape. These would have been right around the shoreline of the Paleo Lake. And so they would have been dug into old lake sediments. And for some reason, the preservation was really bad. It was bad here. It was terrible here. And I'll show you some pictures in a second, but there was not a lot of work that could be done, unfortunately, because they were so poorly preserved. But we did find, as you can see, a lot of new sites. So they have been here quite a while to be able to have all these different areas. And also of interest is, whereas these burials, these cemeteries here, weren't really near any habitation sites, they were nearer the habitation sites. So they probably were just buried right outside where people had been living. But yeah, here's an example of how poor the preservation is. So you can see on the left here, you can see the skull, and oops, you can see the skull, the teeth are still there, but if for some reason the bottom half of the skeleton is completely gone. It wasn't as though they were disturbed later, it's just that the preservation was so poor that this was more or less just bone dust here. And then this guy over on the right here, his skull was almost completely gone, although the rest of the skeleton was there. So the preservation was just really bad. So it was very hard to collect data. So any data that I did collect had to be done in situ, that is directly on the bones, but because it was so bad, I couldn't get as much information on like the stature and the skeletal health. But fortunately, the teeth are still present, so I could still get quite a bit of information out of that. And once back in the lab, this is our field lab, you can see what the bones look like. They're just fragments. There's nothing left. Little few bone shafts. Here are some teeth. Here I'm trying to reconstruct a skull. But the remains are in very poor shape in these later cemeteries, or I should say the more recent ones that we excavated. So in a recent article, I included Gebel Ramlah. It wasn't the focus of this paper, but I did include it in this paper. And we are now up to over 200 individuals from these sites. And I collected, in this case, dental non-metric data, which is the surface morphology of the teeth and the roots in 82 individuals. And so as you can see right here, here's Gebel Ramlah, Neolithic period. They were intensive collectors and pastoralists. This is the time period they lived, so about 6,600 years ago to 6,400 years ago. And they were compared to all of these other samples. These are other Nubian populations. In fact, these are all Nubian populations in this particular study. And based on dental morphology, which has a really high genetic component, you can use the teeth, the dental morphology, as proxies for ancient DNA. And so by doing this, you can look, based on what the teeth look like, you can see how closely related they are to other populations. And so that's what this is all about that I was doing here. And so this is something called multidimensional scaling. simplest thing to do is to just point out where Gebel Ramlah is. And all it means is that based on this dental morphology, which shows genetic relatedness, is where Gebel Ramlah is located to these other samples that I showed you. So you can see that it's closest, we're talking here about Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. Lower Nubia is like in, it's kind of backward thinking. Lower means north because the Nile runs to the north. And so Lower Nubia would be the southern half of Egypt, and Upper Nubia and into the northern part of Sudan. And then Upper Nubia is like the middle of northern Sudan down to like where Khartoum is at. And what this is showing is that these are people that are farther south, these are farther north. Here's Gebel Ramlah. And there is a clear distinction between the people from upper and lower, which would make sense because they're separated from one another, reproductively isolated to some extent, although the Nile did act as a north-south highway for people to move back and forth. But so here's Gebel Ramlah looking most like the Lower Nubians, yet still somewhat distinct. It's also quite distinct from Egyptian samples, which I'm not showing in this particular study. So what it's showing is that the people at Gebel Ramlah were quite heterogeneous. They didn't necessarily comprise one common population, but maybe different peoples all kind of combined. And that's interesting. It just shows that unlike most of these other sites where the people living in the site are quite closely related to one another, these people probably were not. They were a little bit, people from maybe the south, from the north, from the east, from the west. And because they're moving back and forth, fission and fusion of groups, you'd have some new people move in. So that might explain why they looked to be somewhat different than the others. That's just one possibility. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up here was that this is a diagram of the world's earliest known infant cemetery. So within the area that was closest to the to the Paleo Lake, we found a cemetery that contained infants only. This is the first we've ever heard of it. Normally they would be included within the cemetery, or certain societies would bury children separately, like a lot of the Native Americans in the desert southwest of the US would bury children in the floor of the houses for different reasons. But in this case, they had their own cemetery. And so what this is doing is, we originally thought, wow, we're not finding any children or young infants, young children. So not only were they tall and had no cavities, but they obviously were very healthy, that there wasn't a lot of childhood illness and death. But what this shows is that this makes up for some of that, and that there were quite a few more infant deaths and child deaths than we thought. It's just that they were in their own cemetery. And what's also interesting here is that these three areas here, this one in white, white, and white, these are all adult females. And in two cases, this one on the left, this one on the right, you can see that north is in this direction off to the right. These two had died in childbirth. The one, I can't remember which one, I think it was this one on the left, the infant had not passed through the birth canal. So she died in childbirth, and the child was there. And on this side, she would have died potentially right after birth because the infant had been placed across her chest. And so what we find interesting is that just adjacent to this was the cemetery for the adult individuals, but yet these adults were not buried in the adult cemetery. They were, because they may have had young children or died during childbirth, were buried in the infant cemetery. So we're still trying to figure this out. Really interesting. So really amazing. We have everything from perinate, which could be premature infants, to neonates, to infants, and then children up to 36 months old, so 3 years. And so this also is interesting because it tells us something about what these folks considered to be an adult, or what they may have considered personhood, when someone becomes a person in their eyes. In this case, children that were 3 years of age, or over 3 years of age, were buried in the adult cemetery. Those less of 3 years and less of age were buried in the infant cemetery. So that's quite interesting. So bottom line conclusion, the subadult mortality is higher than we originally thought, but many adults reached an advanced age, so they were still pretty darn healthy. The tall statures is also indicative of very good health relative to later Egyptians and Nubians in the region I mentioned. Other indications of good health and long life also include almost a near absence of skeletal and dental pathology. Got to take this skeletal pathology with a grain of salt, though, because the skeletal remains were, many of them, not all, a lot of them were in such poor condition that perhaps if there was skeletal pathology, it was just, we couldn't find it. And then last but not least, the population seems to be biologically related to both Egyptians and Nubians, but is still distinct from both. And that's the end. There's our